July morning, 1944. A low gray light smeared across hedgerow country near St. Lo, and the rumble of engines was the only punctuation in a landscape that had once held farms and children's laughter. Poole sat with his back against the turret bustle, hands resting where the controls waited. The world narrowed to glass, metal, and a single decision: close or die. If you want to follow the full story of how one man and his crew rewrote what a Sherman could do, stay until the end and subscribe. He had learned hunting on the plains of Texas. As a boy, he knew how sound traveled through brush, how a sudden snap meant an animal had changed direction, how patience turned into advantage. Those lessons lived in the small, precise motions he made now: head tilt, eye sweep, a barely audible command to the driver. The tank was a different kind of blind animal, but the rules of survival were the same. Read the ground, move fast, and make the first violent choice. Poole's Sherman was not the best tank on the field. Its glacis plate could be punched by German rounds at range. Its main gun had shorter reach than the long-barreled weapons that rode in Panthers and Tigers. Doctrine in late 1944 said to keep formations, fight from prepared positions, use combined arms and air cover. Doctrine favored numbers and calculation. Poole favored a close, aggressive geometry that turned distance into a liability for his opponents and a weapon for his crew. Corporal Del Boggs drove with a patient aggression that made him the right hand of Poole's decisions. Willis Ola sat like a metronome in the gunner's seat, quiet, exact, waiting for the crosshair to steady. Bert Close's large hands moved as if they belonged to a different animal. They stripped, loaded, and slammed shells home with a rhythm that would later be timed and studied. Wilbert Richards kept the bow machine gun fed and the loader's cadence honest. Trust threaded them together. Trust turned microseconds into survival. Their company lived by the statistics whispered in briefings. Shermans were numerous, mobile, and replaceable. Against Panthers, they were outclassed in frontal armor and range. Casualty rates were high. Crews had a short average lifespan. That lit a fuse under Poole that doctrine could not reach. He wanted a different arithmetic. The first combat days were tests of patience and stubbornness. Commanders still clung to doctrine. Keep your tanks spaced. Use the main road. Let reconnaissance do its work. That arrangement bled men. The division lost officers whose deaths read on dispatches like grim lessons. Among them, 2nd Lieutenant James Flowers became a turning point. Flowers had been by the book. He refused to accept risky maneuvers and believed in set formations. When a panther watched from the edge of an orchard and picked shots through the hedgerow, Flowers' tank was cut down in a silence so sudden the rest froze. It was not a glorious end. It was a lesson in the ledger no battle plan could erase. Poole watched that end happen from too close. The sense of being outgunned and constrained produced a clear, ugly calculus. Close distance. Reduce the Panther's advantage. At short range, the Panther's long gun could not traverse as rapidly. The angles that made a Sherman vulnerable became, for a moment, the Panther's weakness. Poole began to imagine the enemy as a rattlesnake coiled in the grass. deadly at a distance, but slower to strike when you forced it into a cramped place. He could have kept the formal doctrine and accepted the mathematics of attrition. Instead, he ran a different experiment in the theater itself. Training became obsession. The crew drilled with stopwatches and a kind of hard gentleness. Poole timed Bert's hands. He watched Dell's steering, measured the seconds it took Ola to track a moving target. They practiced reloading on the move, stripping the cumbersome rituals that doctrine assumed. The goal tightened into a number. A reload so fast the next shot could be placed before the enemy could correct. 6 seconds became the shrine of their work. It was not a figure born of bravado. It was born of repetition and the realization that, at that speed, the enemy crew did not have time to aim with a long gun or to dismount and set up a Panzerfaust with confidence. Poole pushed drills until the motion was muscle memory. Bert learned to strip brass and push a new shell with the same 2 hands that had once turned a plow. Richards moved like a shadow, handing rounds with pre-calculated arcs. Ola's eye for lead and range became preternatural because it had been whittled down to a pattern. They practiced in fields at night, under a moon that watched over a convoy of metal beasts. They practiced with orders that filtered down from breakfast. Keep the crew small in speech, efficient in motion. The innovations were modest in description and radical in consequence. Poole's tactics were not about storming alone. They were about committing to a 5-minute geometry where speed, surprise, and absolute cohesion collapsed the enemy's margin for error. Poole would pick a line of advance that took them close under the hedge, sometimes flanking, sometimes headlong down a sunken lane. And then he would order the driver to push the Sherman into a posture that presented minimal profile and maximum momentum. The gunner breathed, aimed, fired. The loader moved as if time were a mechanical friend. The bow gun stung the flank crews into confusion. In those 5 minutes, the Sherman could become a predator. Early runs had clumsy edges. The first time they closed inside a Panther's effective range, the German crew had a heartbeat to react. One of Poole's tankers was hit. Smoke and panic flared. Poole felt the cold counterweight of responsibility. He tightened the procedure. They practiced silent signals. 3 soft knocks on the hull, a thumb pressed to a hatch. A glance down a piece of tape fixed to the mantlet. Commands shrank to essential syllables. The tank was less a machine than a living organism learning to breathe as one. The method was effective because it traded technological inferiority for human synchronization. Electric motors and bigger guns did not win against the cowed and the quick. Poole's Shermans were neither the heaviest nor the longest gunned, but they were precise instruments of motion. When they ran, tracks churning, the sound of their approach became a percussion that denied the enemy the luxury of patience. A patrol in early August found them skulking toward a village where German armor had been sighted. Poole had a habit of walking the ground when he could, feeling the texture of earth like a man checking the belly of a horse. He mapped drainage ditches and hedgerows with the same attention he had once given to deer trails. For that fight, he chose a plan that put them parallel to a sunken road, using the bank and a thin copse as cover. It was a dangerous geometry. One wrong move, and the Sherman would expose its flank. "Driver, hold to the bank," Poole said. Dell obeyed, and the Sherman breathed over the crest. A panther crouched in the village square, barrel turned like a finger. The panther fired. The shot punched a thunder into the morning and took the house off its feet. But the panther's traverse had been slow. The crew's drill took the place of armor. Ola's aim found the turret ring. Bert's hand slammed the second shell, then the third. The panther's engine choked. The crew bailed, confusion in their faces. Poole's Sherman rolled forward, a predator that had closed the space. The credit lists in post-war dispatches would record runs like that as part of a streak. They would call it a run of confirmed vehicle kills, and historians would later piece those days into an arc. But inside each event, there were small human things that did not fit in tallies. The white steam rising from a burning engine when rain met diesel, the smell of burnt canvas, the way a loader swore under his breath when brass jammed, the silence that thrummed after the last shot when men checked each other's eyes for shock or nausea. Poole did not celebrate. He took inventory. Losses accumulated everywhere. Captain Robert Nance died in a meeting that turned to a firefight, a phrase that must be said plainly. War took men whose names would have otherwise been ordinary. Nance's death hardened something in Poole's jaw. He kept his face arranged in the small, unmovable ways of a man who had seen enough to temper sentiment. That stoicism was not coldness. It was a way to make decisions. Poole's crew learned to read the way his mouth tightened when a plan needed to change. As the months folded, Poole's method began to ripple. Other commanders watched with different reactions. Some dismissed his maneuvering as reckless. Others saw a grim utility. There were arguments at headquarters. Men who lived by doctrine feared precedent that depended on individual improvisation. Men who had lost sons to theory stared at Poole's results and did their best to contain them inside an institutional envelope. The Army studied the rhythms because it had to. Every innovation with survival implications demanded examination. Some of Poole's tactics were folded into lessons and then issued as cautious recommendations. Others were archived as anomalies that could not safely be taught wholesale. Those debates mattered, but they were secondary to the immediate geometry of the next engagement. The machine of war kept turning. Poole continued to push the edge because the edge saved lives when it was nimble. On a cold morning at the Belgian border, a fight escalated into the sort of concentrated violence that carved out reputations. Poole's company moved along a road that cut through woods and farms. The German resistance was sturdier than expected. Anti-tank guns lay in ambush. Poole's formation was not perfect. No formation ever was. He sensed the tightening net and ordered a split. Split to the hedgerow, close fast, hit the gap. They ran. The Sherman's tracks churned, and the engine's tone rose to a high keening that matched the crew's cadence. A shot ripped through the air and smashed into the rear panel. The tank lurched, metal groaned, and smoke began to braid up from the engine deck. For a second, the world narrowed to pain and noise. Poole's knee slammed into a hatch, the control stuck. Dell swore, and he kept the Sherman rolling as if wheels turned on a belief rather than a machine. Ola fought the gun. His hands were a blur. Bert gave a shout and pushed another shell home without looking. They came out of the hedgerow into a clearing where two enemy vehicles squatted. Poole's aim found them in sequence. The first burned. The second stopped. The world rang in static. Officers later would call that run aggressive and costly and efficacious. To those who rode in the tank, it was a succession of decisions and breathless seconds. They counted the moments not in clock time, but in the measures of mechanical precision that had become muscle memory. Not every run ended in success. There were moments when a shell blew the turret ring, or when the bow crew was shredded by a lucky shot. Those incidences imprinted on survivors. Poole carried memories heavier than medals. The crew told stories in sparse words. Once, over a can of reconstituted coffee too weak to scald, Bert spoke and said nothing more than, "We got lucky." Wilbert looked at him and added, "Lucky and practiced." That, perhaps, was the line that mattered most. Luck flowers where preparation has tilled the soil. Poole's method sometimes worked because the enemy simply did not expect such close, coordinated violence from a Sherman. When a Panther crew had seconds to react, they often could not complete the sequence of aiming, calculating range, and placing a decisive shot. The psychological effect was real. On occasion, Poole could watch an enemy hatch flick open and then close in bewilderment, a hesitation that was itself exploited into destruction. That hesitation was not mystical, it was cognitive, the result of being forced out of the scenario the enemy's training had prepared them for. The cost of such attacks sat at the center of Poole's nights. He dreamed in fragments of burning metal and men reaching for each other across charred steel. He kept letters from home folded into his tunic like talismans. He wrote little notes when he could and kept them private, scraps of a life that had nothing to do with war. After an engagement that left a fellow commander missing and another hospital-bound, Poole sat alone on the engine deck and smoked until the cigarette burned his fingers. He did not religiously ruminate on what he had done. He catalogued outcomes and wrote down corrections for the next maneuver. That was his way of staying honest with himself. Flower's death had changed him, and Nance's had shifted him further. The company's losses were a ledger. Poole's responses were tactical, then human, then tactical again. The drills continued. The 6-second mark hardened into an almost religious number that they recited to themselves as practice. It was not vanity, it was the arithmetic of survival. Word of their results began to travel up the chain. Some commanders shouted them down, others gleaned what they could. Orders arrived that were ambiguous, a nod to the efficiency of small crews, but not a full endorsement of doing away with doctrine. Poole recognized the institutional hesitation and, with a kind of professional humility, kept doing what he thought best. He refused glory. When a film crew from an army office came to record a demonstration, he brushed the idea aside with a grin and said, "I'm no showman. I'm a man trying to get my boys home." The streaks of success created a certain mythology on the ground. Men began to call them the hidden 5 minutes, a short period during which absolute cohesion and speed could turn a Sherman from prey into predator. The phrase existed among tankers because it matched what they felt under their palms. A cluster of minutes so dangerous and so decisive that one mistake could mean death and one perfect sequence could mean survival. Poole's crew lived inside that window when they engaged. They learned to trust a rhythm, the slow intake, the violent sprint, the stunned silence, the quick aftercare. Then came the day when the 5 minutes turned against them. The field ahead was littered with the skeletons of vehicles and makeshift barricades. Poole chose an axis that would put their Sherman in a position to mask behind a rubble wall and then push forward into a gap in the hedge. The plan called for speed and precise traversal. A shot came from behind a ruined farmhouse, an anti-tank gun, slotted like a black tooth. The shell struck with a sound that altered the color of the morning. Poole felt the blast as a pressure through his chest. Metal screamed. Fire found the engine deck. The hull shook. There was a smell, a hot, metallic sweetness that played at the edges of his mouth. Poole gave a command that was more muscle than speech. Dell fought the tracks free of wedged debris and pushed the Sherman forward. Bert worked the loader's carousel, teeth set. Ola prayed in a soft, private way he had never shared, fingers tightening on the sight. The next impact tore into the turret. Glass shattered. Ola's left hand went numb. Poole felt something hot and then nothing. He heard a noise like a bell inside his skull and tasted dust. The world collapsed into a set of discrete observations. A burst of light, a clanging, somebody shouting his name. He tried to move and found resistance like a lead blanket across his legs. A searing pain lanced through his thigh and up his groin. He realized, with a small, clear horror, that he had been hit. They got him out. Soldiers are efficient where needed. The crew pulled him over the turret lip and down into the ditch, where medics met them with a competence that tasted like relief. Poole watched Dell's face and saw the old faith. If we can move, we might live. Someone strapped a tourniquet. Someone else barked orders like a man who had rehearsed them in a life that was all about being prepared. Evacuation was a blur of motion and white lights and the smell of antiseptic. Poole's thoughts were not dramatic. He thought of the crew, of Bert's hands, of Ola's jaw. He thought of a future in which routine things, mowing grasses, hunting in a quiet lane, might return. He thought, with a clarity that was not spared by pain, of faces of boys who had trusted him with small movements that meant life. Surgery followed. They would remove what the blast had irreparably damaged. The list of procedures read like the road back from a place he did not want to visit again. Wounds were sutured, flesh rearranged. In a ward that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, he heard the names of men who would never leave. He slept and woke in a world that had been rearranged. The wound ended his combat career. He would spend the rest of the war in hospitals and convalescence, sometimes dreaming of the engine's tone. When the doctors told him the extent of what had been lost, Poole's reaction was practical. There was no melodrama in it, no grand lament broadcast across a column. He made lists. Paper and ink had always steadied him. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Dia e lists. Paper and ink had always steadied him. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. He wrote a short note to Dell and to Ola, telling them to keep the drills, to keep the time, to keep the rhythm. He wanted, in the small way he could still effect, to pass on the method. Post-war life was quieter in a way that did not reconcile with battlefield memory. Poole returned to Texas, where cotton fields and mesquite brush waited with a patience only the land could have. He spoke little of the war. When people asked, he offered facts and short sentences. He met old friends for coffee and watched children run where he had once hunted deer. The community treated him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. But public fame did not equal the private ledger he kept.
He had been recommended for awards by commanders who saw the logic and the virtue in his actions. The record shows that official recognition did not always mirror field reputation. That did not change the fact that a number of men owed their lives to techniques he had honed. Institutions paid attention in their own way. After the fighting, Army boards studied engagement records and tactical notes. Some of Poole's methods, emphasis on crew drills, reload efficiency, aggressive close maneuvering under certain conditions, appeared in training manuals as cautious options. The military bureaucracy, deliberate by nature, adopted fragments rather than wholesale revolutions. That was both a victory and a rebuke. A victory because lessons were preserved. A rebuke because the human improvisation that made those lessons effective could not be neatly packaged and mass-issued. There remained the matter of memory. On parade grounds and in brief histories, Poole's name appeared as a footnote or a headline, depending on the audience. Scholars and tank aficionados debated the arc of his results, unpacking operational reports and cross-checking logs. Veterans who had been in the ditch with him spoke in different tongues, some with reverence, some with the weary irony of men who had seen too much. Poole himself, when asked about the cost, would only say in a voice that had the roughness of tobacco and weather, "We did what we thought would get us home." In the quiet that followed, he thought often about timing. The 6 seconds never stopped being a talisman. It was an ugly, necessary truth that the narrow window of coordinated action could conserve life when applied correctly and could be a butcher's trick when abused. He had seen both. He had seen men bend and break under the strain of making such choices, and he had seen other men, blessed by competence and a little fortune, walk away. Years later, an Army study, referenced in staff notes, would imply that small unit improvisation under certain constraints could yield disproportionate results. That was the language of institutions: measured, cautious, sanitized. It was also true. Poole's methods had created outcomes that could be described in statistical terms: runs of destroyed vehicles, stretches of territory taken without grinding attrition.
But those numbers never told what there was to tell. The faces of friends, the quiet moments of return, the private regrets. On a late afternoon, decades after the war, Poole walked a fence line with his hands in his coat pockets. The sun lay flat on the earth. A wind came up and moved through cotton bolls. He watched a boy run past, a dog at his heels, and he felt the old mapping of the ground bud back to life. The war had given him a shorthand. The land gave him the long way home. He died with honors that were enough for a small town, and not the full measure the field reports might have suggested. Historians would later assemble a portrait that emphasized the tactical ingenuity and human costs equally. Lectures in academies would show diagrams of hedgerows, trajectories, and timings. Veterans groups would remember the crew's names with a solemnity that made histories human. Poole's legacy did not fit cleanly into a medal case or a classroom discussion. It lived in drills practiced by loaders and in the wary respect of commanders who had to make narrow choices in broad wars. The hidden 5 minutes were a tactical artifact and a moral question. They demonstrated that individual decisiveness and cohesive training could upend mechanical superiority. They showed how familiarity and discipline could shift the calculus of survival. But they also left a residue of sorrow. A list of men who had died, a series of families who had been reshaped, a man who carried scars both seen and unseen. In the end, his story asked what it meant to act under pressure when institutions and individual judgment diverged. Poole's answer was practical. Train, trust your crew, move fast, and bear the consequences. The life that followed his wounds was not empty of meaning. It was the slow work of living, mending fences and teaching boys how to read tracks in the dirt. He taught them to listen, to wait, and to make one right, hard decision rather than many tentative ones. There were pages of afterward, assessments that cataloged vehicle losses and the specific dates of engagements. There were debates about doctrine and whether his methods could be sanitized into training manuals without losing the crucial quality of judgment. There were also small gestures. A letter from a man who had not known whether he would live. A photograph of a crew together on the tank's fender. The odd reunion where they met, older and quieter, to drink weak coffee and say less. When the archives opened, researchers found the raw reports and the slower human accounts and stitched them together into the larger history. Poole's record became an object lesson in adaptation. How one commander's refusal to accept the arithmetic of defeat reshaped a tiny corner of a much larger war. The lessons carried forward not as gospel, but as options, techniques to be used by commanders who understood risk and the human cost.
Uma guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Commanders who understood risk and the human cost. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Fim das instruções. On a table in a small museum, a model Sherman sat with tracks dusted and a tiny plaque beside it. Visitors read the terse description, and then, if they read further, they found the names of the crew. The model could not hold the sound of engines, or the stench of burnt canvas, or the small dry humor of men who had survived. It could only point to the fact that ordinary people, placed in extraordinary circumstances, sometimes chose differently and paid for it in ways that no museum plaque could fully measure. Poole's name would not shine everywhere, but it endured where it mattered, among crews who listened for the inner timing of a machine and learned to make those hidden 5 minutes the difference between life and death. The next chapter of this story examines a particular engagement that became emblematic of Poole's method and the institutional debates that followed. How a platoon report traveled up command channels and initiated the slow, contentious process of incorporation into doctrine. It will also trace the precise sequence that led to Poole's wound and detail the medical aftermath with the restraint the subject warrants. They filed the platoon report the same afternoon, in the thin light after the hedgerows had given up their smoke. The narrative began with the map, a jagged line of bocage, a narrow lane slipping through a pinched pocket of fields, a farmstead half hidden by elder trees. Orders, written in the company notebook, were brief and formal. Push through, secure the lane, link with the infantry on the far side. What the pages did not carry was the rhythm of the ground, the soft give of churned clay in a track, the small betrayals of a landscape that favored concealment. Poole's account was the clearest of the lot because he had been alive to write it. He wrote with the impatience of a man who believed that detail mattered, the way the light shifted at first fire, the cadence of the loader's calls, the hiss that meant a round had found the engine compartment. He described the ambiguity, false contacts that turned out to be hedgerow tangles, voices on the flank that might have been the infantry's until they were not. He wrote down the timing, not in whole minutes, but in the small divisions that had mattered. 30 seconds to clear the lane's entrance, 2 minutes for the leading tank to cross the break. 5 minutes, those hidden 5 minutes, when the platoon did not peel back, but instead tightened, let the enemy reveal himself, then struck. What Poole emphasized, time and again, was a decision he had made as a reflex, to make the enemy commit before he withdrew. Doctrine at higher echelons favored immediate suppression, fire and move, keep the enemy from coalescing into a coordinated response. Poole's method was quieter.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é narrador/palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Coordinated Response. Poole's method was quieter. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. He taught his crews to accept a brief exposure, 5 minutes, in which they would seem vulnerable, so they could observe the enemy's pattern, see where the anti-tank teams would reveal their hand, hear the tracer come from woods rather than open ground. Those minutes were a crucible. They were where discipline replaced panic, and where a crew's training showed itself in the small efficiencies of motion. The loader's hand already on the next shell, the driver's eye finding the hollow in the hedgerow, the gunner's jaw set. The engagement itself began as a whisper of gunfire and swelled into the rough music of battle. A Panther or an 88 never declared itself politely. The enemy that morning had a mesh of guns, hidden by shrubs, mounted in barns, slung on the shoulders of men deep in ditches. When they struck where the lane narrowed and where the lead Sherman found itself uncomfortably aligned. Poole had anticipated contact on the flank, but not the ferocity of the first volley. His tank took a hit to the turret ring, the cupola shivered, and a sliver of metal bit into the air pressure. For a breath, instruments stilled. Then the drill took over. They reversed a scant 10 yards, not in blind retreat, but in an economy of motion that kept their frontal plates angled toward the cut where the enemy had to expose itself to fire. The radio crackled with terse updates, calls that were shorter than fear and longer than command. Poole's voice, when it came, was low and sharp. He called for smoke, for the infantry to close, for the other tanks to swing like a hand closing. In the chaos, a secondary thread unreeled. A Panzerfaust team had crept through a broken fence and began to work themselves into the lee of a hedgerow. Poole saw the flash too late. The blast threw him against the turret ring, a plate claiming part of his shoulder and sending a hot complaint of pain through his chest. He would later demur from the precise cataloging of injury. Medics prefer the bare facts, and men prefer a story that makes sense of pain. But the platoon report carried the physiological breadcrumb trail. Shock, loss of color, the metallic taste in the mouth, words failing for a moment. The corporal who steadied him later would swear to the way Poole's fingers tightened on the hatch rim when he had to give an order by one breath and a grimace. There was, even in the wound, the logic of leadership. The man who could not be still would not let silence be a surrender. Evacuation came as its own choreography. A medic jumped across the lane with a carrier and a blanket. The young man smelled of disinfectant and tobacco. His hands were sure. Poole remembered being lifted, the world condensed to the clack of boots and the mule bay of voices. The field dressing was blunt, professional. A stretcher ride through hedgerow shadows, the smell of crushed grass and burned lubricant, then the low, efficient panic of the clearing station. Lamps, pounding pulses, the steady language of surgeons who see the human body as both casualty and equation. The medical aftermath was an interlude of small humiliations and steady kindnesses. Poole learned the routines of the hospitals in the way a man learns the rhythm of a church. The bell that meant visiting hours, the chair that held a letter from a mother who had not yet learned the details of distance. Surgeons worked with what the war offered: shrapnel, laceration, infection. And the instruments were blunt with use. They could not promise full recovery. They could promise the removal of what threatened life and the making of what might be called a future. He spent weeks convalescing in a ward where sunlight drew lines on white sheets. He practiced the private business of being alive in small increments, sitting up for a meal, then for an hour, walking along a corridor with a cane, reading a dispatch and closing it when the world got too sharp. Letters arrived. One from a lieutenant who had been under his command, written in an ink that trembled with gratitude. Another from a stranger who had been in the lane that morning and wanted to thank the man who had held a window open for life. Those notes were more than sentiment. They were proof that a life continued to exert an influence beyond the wounds. The platoon report moved through the chain of command like a pebble down a stream. First a company, then battalion, then brigade. Each transfer added a thin bureaucratic sheen. Stamped receipts, placid notations, the kinds of phrases that smooth over contingency. Engagement completed. Casualty evacuation completed. But in the margins of some reports there was unease. The Battalion S3 wrote a note that was also a question. Could the hidden 5 minutes method be replicated? It read as a query, but carried the weight of doctrine trembling at an alteration. Higher command was not instantly converted. Doctrine has the inertia of an old plow. It cuts a furrow and resists new lines. Staff officers in the division argued in memos about risk matrices and casualty ratios. Some claimed Poole had been lucky, a man who had taken an unacceptable gamble that, by temperament and timing, had paid off. Others saw the method as a salvageable skill, a way to force the enemy's hand without sending every tank forward into a death trap. The debate was not just about equipment and maps. It was about trusting the judgment of subordinate commanders when the charts said one thing and the ground said another. Eventually, the argument produced a compromise, a field circular that did not enshrine Poole's methods as doctrine, but that authorized a series of trials. Training units were tasked to rehearse the short exposure tactic in controlled conditions. Simulations were run in cornfields and mock hedgerows. Drill instructors taught crews to count the seconds in a different way, to accept that sometimes a deliberate risk, bounded and known, could yield tactical gain. The circular advised caution and recommended after-action debriefs be formalized. It said nothing of courage, for courage is harder to print. Poole returned to the line with his shoulder bandaged and a new, quieter patience. He carried the hurt like a folded map, consulted when needed, but otherwise kept in a pocket. Men who saw him watched for any sign that wounding had diminished his edge. They found none. If anything, he moved with a slower deliberation that made his decisions seem measured rather than rash. Where once he might have closed his jaw and charged, he now calculated the opening, waited for the first false movement from the enemy, and then struck in a way that left less to chance.
There were small, private fragments of aftermath that never made it into doctrine. A young loader who had survived because he had trusted Poole's voice wrote years later of the moment they shared tea in a quarry after the armistice. How Poole taught him to read a track like a book, to see not just where a man had been, but where he intended to go. An infantry lieutenant carried the memory of the smoke pocket that had bought the platoon 2 minutes, 2 minutes that had let his men close gaps and avoid a slaughter. Such recollections populated the reunions and letters and, oddest of all, informed the hands of men who would teach the next generation of commanders how to think in small temporal units rather than whole battles. The medical record of Poole's injury remained within the neat pages of military medicine. There was mention of shrapnel extraction and the slow phase of rehabilitation. There were notes on infection narrowly avoided, on wounds that left a permanence, a scar across a shoulder, a slight stiffness in turning a hatch that would not appear on parade but would be felt when mornings were cold. It was a modest list of injuries. It did not capture the way memory taught him to shift weight when climbing into a tank, or the occasional painful flare when rain fingered at the sky. Those were private calibrations. What the doctrine deliberations could not entirely quantify was the moral arithmetic that accompanied the hidden 5 minutes. For every life spared by a shrewd delay, there was a life spent close to the seam where luck and judgment met. Poole's method forced commanders to accept a different kind of responsibility. Not the tidy responsibility of a map that showed lines and reserves, but the muddier one of choosing which risk to take for which men and which fields. Some argued that such choices were beyond the scale of doctrine and belonged instead to conscience. Others believed doctrine should simply give better options. Years later, in the notebooks that students pored over in lecture halls, Poole's name appeared as an example of adaptive leadership. The lecture would show a diagram, the lane, the hedgerows, the pauses marked in ink. An instructor would speak of initiative and the value of trust between commander and crew. But alongside the diagram, older men in the audience, survivors who carried the smell of diesel in their memory, would exchange looks that meant, yes, and do not forget the faces that paid for that initiative. Academic emphasis and quiet memory sat side by side like two witnesses to the same event. The immediate aftermath of Poole's wound also produced a private reckoning. He found himself, in quiet evenings, returning to the lane in his head. He traced the 5-minute intervals as if they were beads, each one holding a small decision. Sometimes he imagined alternatives, a different turn, a delay of 10 heartbeats, a louder command that might have caused a different set of bodies to die or live. The exercise was not masochism. It was the work of a man trying to order an unruly memory into something teachable to others. Toward the end of his convalescence, he was visited by a young captain from the training branch. The captain carried a stack of blank forms and a quiet eagerness that made him seem both earnest and nervous. He asked questions in the way of men who mean to learn. "What did you see first, sir? When did you decide to hold? How did you brief your loader in the moment?" Poole answered without flourish. He spoke of drills, of the cadence of commands, of the small economies of motion that let a crew act as one. He pointed at a blank page and drew a crude map with a stick on the ward's floor. Hedgerow, lane, smoke pocket. He spoke the way a man speaks when the past is a tool rather than a torment. What emerged from that exchange was not a manifesto, but the beginnings of a manual, a cluster of recommended practices, the kind of thing that could be practiced until it became reflex. It would be years before those notes were synthesized into training circulars, and still longer before they were smoothed into doctrine. But in that ward, with sunlight cutting the dust motes in half, the notion that habits could be taught was planted with a modest certainty. There were, after all, other lives that went on around Poole's wound. A crewman who had been with him that morning, married in a small chapel, the pew packed with men who had fought together and whose laughter now had the brittle edges of experience. Old adversaries later met at the margins of a peace fair and spoke in a language of mutual respect. A model tank was later placed in the town museum under a glass case, and children pressed their faces to it, asking why the metal had been dented. The answer, because men chose and men were chosen, was too large for a plaque, but it was the story the town told quietly at suppers, and in the kindly, blunt way neighbors spoke of sacrifice. Poole himself lived long enough to see his methods taught and modified, to watch debates resolve into manuals, and manuals fray into practice.
Ia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era live into manuals and manuals fray into practice. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. He bore the wound and the memory of it as two different things. One a bodily reminder, the other a lesson with edges. In quieter moments, he still walked fence lines, hands in his coat pockets, listening for the particular music of the wind in cotton bolls. He had learned to measure time in smaller units, to value the compressible interval that could change a result. That practice of counting, of waiting, of trusting a trained crew to keep its nerve, was the practical residue of something larger, the difficulty of acting under pressure when institutions and individual judgment diverged. The hospital notes, the platoon report, the memos, and the later training manuals would all convene in an institutional memory. Yet there remained a personal ledger, letters tucked into a drawer, a photograph of a crew on a tank's fender, the informal prayers of men who had survived. Those were the measures that did not appear in doctrine, but that guided how men taught one another to be brave and, hopefully, alive. In the field, doctrine provides frameworks. In the hedgerow, a man's voice and a crew's drill determine the immediate terms of survival. Poole's wound sat between those two truths, a bodily fact and an argument about how to live within the constraints of war. The debate it set off would take years to filter through training rooms and staff desks. But in the weeks after he was carried from the lane, men who had been there already began to tell the story, by map, by memory, by tea in a quarry, so that Poole's 5 minutes might become something more than an accident of courage. They might become, if only in part, a skill taught to the next loader who climbed into a tank, and the next driver who learned to read a track like a line of script. The next report would argue tactics, letters home would argue for mercy, a training circular would argue caution. The final accounting would be none of those things alone. It would be the accumulation of choices made in the hedgerow and the slow work of recovering from them, medical, moral, and institutional. Poole's life after those days was a slow stitching together of what had been torn, and it would leave him, in the end, with a set of small certainties. Train hard, trust the man beside you, make one right hard decision rather than many tentative ones, and carry the consequences without theatrality. He returned to ceremonies and reunions with a measured acceptance of praise. He accepted medals with the same economy he had taught his crews, with respect for the gesture and the knowledge that the meaning of any honor lay in what it directed men to do afterward. The wound that had taken its toll remained a private map of the morning when the 5 minutes had mattered most, and the thing he taught afterward was plain, that training can make that window of minutes into a place of choice rather than a realm of chance. In time, the institutional papers would close on their debate, and the museum would shelter its models.